I will introduce our next speaker, who is Sebastian Obertür, Professor and Academic Director at the Institute for European Studies at the Free University of Brussels. Sebastian has followed international climate policy developments closely since the 1990s, since the very beginning, both as a scholar and as a science policy advisor to the German Ministry of the Environment. We are very proud to have you here and look forward to your input. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction, and thanks very much for setting up this conference and the tremendous effort I think that you and your team have done here. It's really great to be here. I actually make sure that my title of the talk is clear from the beginning. Towards the 2015 Paris Agreement, recalibrating international climate governance. And since research and communication sciences shows that in these kinds of presentations you keep about 7% of the content, I'll try to put the message up front. Recalibrating international climate governance, I mean rethinking it, but then also I think adjusting the international rule system for the 2015 Paris Agreement. Obviously, that has then consequences for the expectations and objectives that we should have for 2015, and that will be the major point of the presentation. Also a reflection on the historical development of international climate governance. Where are we in this process? And we need to look at what are some of the undercurrents, some of the forces that are driving international climate policy. And this will obviously shape what we can expect and what should be our objectives for the 2015 Paris Agreement. And that will then be the major point. And the little conclusion at the end, will it be worth it? We all know this, but it's perhaps useful to have another look. These are energy-related CO2 emissions. They have grown especially in the developing countries, non-Annex 1 countries. And if you have a little bit of a regional overview, then you can see what most of us also know. This is the China line. It's enormous. We see some other dynamics in some other regions, but nowhere is it really going down very much so far. And these are, by the way, IEA data, as is mentioned. Okay, that's kind of the environmental problem. And there's more. There may be countries and actors where lack of resources, lack of capacity is an important impediment that needs to be addressed. There may be varying problem perceptions around the world. There may be various varying problem perceptions in terms of distribution of justice and who should do what. And there's geopolitics and relative gains logic. I think that has grown very much since Copenhagen, at least. So some of the big players are actually not just looking at, is this the collective action problem, what's climate, but also how does my behavior in this area influence my position in the world towards other powers, and am I losing or gaining relative to them? And I think we can especially see that in the US-China relationship, obviously, where that's part of the game. So my conclusion from that would be it's actually different mixes of problems for different actors and countries. And just always having the starting point that it's a collective action problem, so we need international cooperation, perhaps doesn't tell us the whole story and perhaps leads us the wrong way of thinking about that. It's in a way, although it's difficult enough, it's too easy. So I would try to keep that in mind when we think about the international solution. Perhaps the international solution does not just need to address the collective action problem and the competitiveness concerns, but it needs to take into account absolute costs, that is part of the problem for some of the actors, that we need to create capacity, resources, etc. A reflection on historical development of international climate governance. We all know the big steps in the development of international climate policy. In 1992, we had the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It had as a quasi-target year the year 2000. Then we moved on to the 1997, and I put the 2001 there because that was the Marrakesh Accords, the implementing provisions of the Kyoto Protocol, with a target year of 2010. Copenhagen, Cancun, 2009, 2010, with a target year of 2020, and Paris will be something where countries put on the table what they're going to do towards 2025, 2030. Not quite clear yet whether it will be one or both of these dates. And we also know that the UNFCCC was very soft pledges of stabilizing potentially emissions by the year 2000. That we moved to what's called a rules-based system, a binding system with lots of detailed rules under Kyoto. And kind of it looks like a step backwards, right, to Copenhagen, Cancun soft pledges. Okay, more precise than the UNFCCC was, but very soft system. And what we're probably going to have is in 2050 in Paris kind of something soft, that's perhaps something more strengthened. We are not quite clear about that yet. Some call it ring-fenced, so perhaps the commitments themselves are not exactly binding, the mitigation commitments, but perhaps there will be all kinds of things around it, like reporting, review, etc., that make it more binding. Can talk about that later on. And you can get frustrated by looking at that. Oh, we were so far already with the Kyoto Protocol, now it's going backwards again. And I was very much in that boat. Basically, after Copenhagen in 2009, I said I stopped my advisory role actually in towards the government and the ministry because it's just too frustrating. But is that actually the whole story? Is that how we should look at it? Should we not take this into account? It was actually industrialized countries under the UNFCCC. The pledge to stabilize emissions was only industrialized countries. In Kyoto, it was the mitigation commitments for industrialized countries. And now we have moved global. And looking backwards, I'm thinking, did I really think we would have a global Kyoto Protocol? Perhaps I did. But wasn't that immensely naive? So as analysts, don't we have to step back and say, well, actually we are entering a new ball game here. It's global, so we're kind of starting from scratch, soft, a little bit harder than the UNFCCC, etc. But we will go global in the next step and perhaps move towards more bindingness there. So in a way, as I said, perhaps it's just naive. It's comparing apples with pies if you just go through history. And it was probably unrealistic to believe that we could just build on Kyoto towards the global level. And perhaps what also gets lost is that we have had in both of these arenas, among industrialized countries first and then at the global level, a growth of the institutional governance infrastructure. So a certain level of achievement, and I'm sorry, you'll probably not really be able to read this very well. This is from the UNFCCC website, and gives the overall institutional structure of the global climate change regime. Quite impressive if you look at it, and if you think that in the beginning we started up here having this, the subsidiary bodies and the conference of the parties. But what's important perhaps to see, I think was hinted at before, is that after Copenhagen, Cancun, we have elaborated quite a bit of an infrastructure. We have an adaptation committee, we have a standing committee on finance, we have a whole technology mechanism, and we have here, when you come to funding the Green Climate Fund, and Robin was hinting at the fact that it's perhaps not going fast enough, etc., but we have it, and who knows what will happen during the next months and years in its development. So there is important infrastructure in place that one can build on at the global level. Perhaps we should also not forget that. Let me move on to some of the driving forces and conditions. There are a number of negatives, and obviously you can sometimes discuss whether they are negatives or also have positive connotations. It follows from the analysis before already, we have widely varying preferences, problem perceptions, and equity criteria. I think Robin also talked about that among the parties, among the countries. It really doesn't bode too well for far-reaching agreement. If you look at that, and there were voices last year in Warsaw, people put discussions among the parties and came out and said, how on earth are they ever going to agree within 2 years on anything? Because they're disagreeing on everything. They don't know where they want to go, nothing. So it's a difficult situation up there. We have the power shift, we have the emerging powers rising, shifting power tectonics in the world, I think, and the new political complexity and unclarity. And I think that shows once in a while in the international negotiations, just if you look at that list. In previous years, it was always, in the old days, it was the US discussing with the EU, perhaps India, and then the G77 as a whole. Now you have all kinds of individual country players, and you have these country groups where kind of you tend to lose track. Every negotiating session that you're going to, there are 3 more. So there's the umbrella group, we know that. The non-EU industrialized countries, there are the basics. There are now the LMDCs, the like-minded developing countries. There's the EU, has always been there. AOSIS, small island development states, has also always been there. The least developed countries, the African group. This G77 somehow is out there, but not really anymore, so pretty much disintegrated. Once in a while they try to speak with one voice, like in March in Bonn, and then it falters pretty quickly. And then you have these ILAC, and ALBA, and Rainforest Coalition, and Arab countries, and it gets pretty confusing. I think it's part of the expression of what's going on in the power structure in the world. So that's one other problematic trend and development. I already mentioned the strong zero-sum relative gains logic. That's out there. And we have a dysfunctional decision-making process. Let's be clear about that at the UNFCCC. Consensus decision-making, I think Frank was yesterday talking about that perhaps we need more majority voting, etc. Consensus decision-making, and everybody in at the moment, even those that may not be particularly interested in effective climate action. We have new fossil fuel resources. In between, there was a few years where we thought, okay, it's anyway getting scarce, gas and oil, etc. So we need to move out. Now there's more. It has its positive connotations, as we also heard yesterday, with gas, new gas resources possibly being able to replace coal. And we have a financial and economic crisis, or the aftermath of that, at least also in the EU, is very prominent and limits the role of the EU, I think, internationally additionally. But we also have positives. The crisis of multilateralism and UNFCCC, isn't that great? It doesn't strike one as a positive, but there is a sense of urgency among people in the UNFCCC process. They know it's their kind of last chance. Either they deliver, or there's a danger that the whole process indeed becomes completely irrelevant. And somebody referred to it as the catharsis of Copenhagen somehow also, that you made the experience and now you know that you can't repeat it. There's a growing opportunities narrative of first mover advantage, innovation, cost benefits, new markets. And I think we know that. And it's perhaps not growing as quickly as it did for a few years, but it's still out there and pretty prominent. There was, for example, in the news just a couple of days ago that the Swedish bank SEB forecast that green bonds may require or will require a market share in the bond market by 2020 of 15%. It's growing. There's a tendency there. And we have the renewable energy story, taking off and getting cheaper and competitive. A few graphs about that. That's solar power, photovoltaics, the development from 2000 to 2013. And what you see is obviously the overall growth, quite dynamic. And what you also see is, in terms of countries and regions, it diversifies. It spreads from Europe, that's blue, to China. America is growing also. In here is also India and other parts of Asia and Japan. It's growing. And it's not least due to this kind of cost curve from the 70s, where the costs have gone down tremendously. And in many countries, we have now a situation where solar power is below grid parity, as it's called. And it's starting to become really competitive in some areas. The growth, as well as the cost decline, is projected to continue. So what's perhaps also important to note is when this all happened. And I think I would like to make an argument that very much relates to what Robin also said at the end. We can't really, we shouldn't see the international process as separate from what happens at other levels. Obviously, the causality here is not very clear, but it is in the 2000s. It is when the Kyoto implementation takes off. It is when the discussions at the international level take off that this whole process really takes off. It's in the 2000s, and it's in the 2000s where it spreads to major developing countries. And we have much the same in wind energy. It's spreading, more countries, it's increasing, and it's in the 2000s. And obviously it's national legislation that has driven this to a certain extent. But where did the national legislation come from? It was frequently in Germany, in Europe, implementation of Kyoto. So there is a dynamic out there, and also the costs in wind are going down and are projected to go down further. So there are some hopeful signs there, some dynamics in society and the economy. And there's climate policy development. And I think Robin also hinted at that, and diffusion. This is a graph from Globe, increase of climate legislation in the world. And again, if you looked at also which countries that are, then it's especially industrialized countries in this period, and then the developing world comes on board also. Again, look at the timing. It really takes off. Well, it actually starts when the UNFCCC is adopted, but then it takes off in the 2000s, and it, in my view, is pretty obvious that it has to do with international discussions. in a world map that looks like 1997, this is how the picture looks in terms of climate legislation, and that's 2013. And the darker it is, the more legislation there is. We heard also yesterday, and that's in the IPCC report, that there has been a study that looked and compared 2007 and 2013, I think, and found that in 2007, 45% of global emissions were subject to national legislation, and that share increased by 2013 to 67%. So there's a trend there. And perhaps, in addition, this is the spread of emissions trading systems. As questionable as they may be, there's a trend that there are more emissions trading systems, and obviously that one is very much in question. Not all of them are ready yet. A number of them are being considered, but China is taking action, South Korea is taking action, etc. I don't want to claim with this that we are on a downward path with respect to emissions, because a lot of the legislation may actually not really have that as a result yet. But the infrastructure is getting out there. Countries are getting prepared. And a few of them learn that it can be done. And that's the EU emissions graph of the EU 15 and the EU 27. And what you can see is that policy makes a difference, I think. You see, okay, here's the economic and financial crisis, emissions are going down, but the downward path starts before. EU legislation really takes off from 2000. Then you have a certain period until you really see the effects, until it really gets implemented also at the member state level. And then you see that we are following a downward path and that the EU is already nearly at its minus 20% target for 2020. And what I'm afraid we may see during the following years is that policy has an effect, and the lack of strengthening of policy has an effect in the sense that it will not go down like this over the next years, but flatten and go to minus 22% by 2020. But we are learning that policy can be effective. So where does that bring us overall? The climate transformation is already underway, but it's perhaps not yet strong enough to overcome by itself the status quo forces. That's also obvious. We looked at the emissions graph. It has not yet transformed the international negotiations, which have their own dynamics and inertia and limitations. There are country preferences and values that sometimes are detached of what is going on in the economy, and there are decision-making procedures and negotiating dynamics that are difficult to break. What are then the expectations and objectives for 2015 Paris Agreement against that backdrop? Perhaps also to contextualize, that's again from the UNFCCC website and gives the path to Paris, right? And there's lots of steps, but if you look at the negotiating sessions, June, October, pre-COPs, not a real negotiating session, Lima, it's only a few steps to Paris. We don't have a negotiating text on the table, so what do we expect from them? It will be difficult. The starting point is, I think, that the breakthrough deal is unlikely and is even impossible, given all the above limitations that I referred to. The nationally determined contributions, as it's now called, are unlikely to be sufficiently ambitious. They will not be in line with science, let's be clear about that. The EU in the past always was out there orienting its own pledges, its own commitments towards the science, anymore the point of reference, not even for the EU. So I don't expect the nationally determined contributions to be in line with science, what would be needed towards a 2-degree target. What then Paris should be about is providing a signal and direction to governments, as I said in the beginning, business and societies, rather than the big solution. It should establish the infrastructure and the process that allows for flexible and dynamic strengthening over time. So I think we should see it more as part of a dynamic, multi-level process in which the international needs to deliver its part, but the other levels also need to deliver their part. So we had the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, that triggered action at the national and subnational levels. We had Copenhagen and Cancun perhaps even giving a signal to strengthen that and accelerate that development. What we need is a signal that should continue and should accelerate again. So how do we get that? Signal and direction. There is a talk, I think it results from a number of elements and their combination. So it's difficult to pin it down to one element. This will give the signal. But there are some number of elements that are important, potentially. What's being discussed by some is a long-term goal. We are used to, I know from the Copenhagen world, we were saying, oh, minus 50% globally by 2050. Is that the right message? The message is we need to get out of this stuff. Whether it's 2050, 2060, 2070, 2090, we are on our way out. It needs to be phased out, zero net emissions. That's what the science says. So give that signal, and we could say so explicitly if everybody agrees. The mitigation commitments are not unimportant, obviously. I don't want too much to relativize this. They're an important element. What they mention will give a signal, whether people say, oh, as Robin said, yeah, we can continue to use coal, or whether they say, well, okay, we are moving towards this zero net emissions. And then there should be no backsliding. No country is allowed after it has made its pledge to say after 2 years, actually, I'm not getting there. I'm going backwards. And there should be, or could be, a commitment by each and every country to actually engage in this process of continuous strengthening over the years, to express that. We will move, we will look at that we can strengthen our own actions towards decarbonization and climate resilience. So it perhaps should also not just be limited to mitigation, but also take on board adaptation, means of implementation, and probably also reporting. What's perhaps missing from this list is we also need resources. We need resources, and it needs to give the clear signal that there will be where the investment will not just flow by government regulation, that there will be resources available to trigger that investment in climate protection. I divided it in signal and direction and infrastructure and process, but obviously these are also interrelated. How you structure the process and the infrastructure will also send a signal to the world on where this regime is going, where we're going in climate protection. What we need in terms of infrastructure is another move to enhance transparency, what's called MRV in the negotiations, measuring, reporting and verification, and accounting, what counts, what does not count in the emissions balance. It's amazing that after more than 20 years of international cooperation, we still do not have reliable global figures on an annual basis of emissions. I need to take the IEA CO2 energy-related emission figures, because there is no reporting yet in place that allows us to really have the whole picture. We'll have probably a whole spectrum of commitments in Paris, as it's called, and we'll need to see how we can get transparency on these commitments. It will not just be economy-wide emission targets, but all kinds of other things. We need to create transparency. We need to have adaptation in there. I think it's very clear that adaptation has become acknowledged over the past 10, 15 years as the second, a major pillar in the global regime. But if you look at the Climate Convention, it's not visible. If you look at the Kyoto Protocol, it's not visible. So it needs to get visibility and acknowledgement, and it needs to have the anchoring of the achievements that we had since Cancun in the agreement and push that a bit further. On finance and technologies, it's again, in my view, a lot about anchoring what we have, the Green Climate Fund, etc., and advancing that existing infrastructure. And we should think about a compliance mechanism to enhance trust and make means available to assist countries that are in trouble and perhaps also to address any potential free riding. These are some elements, and there's one more, and that's what people sometimes call ratcheting up mechanism or an ambition mechanism. We need to give this whole thing flexibility and dynamism, but directed. Not just it will change, but it will change towards strengthening over time, and will facilitate that. So it's based on this commitment that I mentioned at the beginning of this section of all countries to move towards that direction. It needs to have a review and progress in that respect, I think, of equity and capacity. What are the criteria that we should apply when we compare our mutual commitments, and who should move and how much? And Robin was talking about how difficult that is. And it is difficult, but I think we need to keep it on the agenda, because otherwise we do not really have a basis for the discussion of how to move forward. We need to have a regular revisiting of the commitments. So if they are insufficient, we need to go back to them. Commitments are not there to just be met. They can also be overachieved, and there can be dynamisms in the development of renewable energies and other areas where we are possible in 2, 3, 4, 5 years to say, well, that was the 2030 target. Actually, I can ratchet that up by 10%. Because the dynamics are there. We can't foresee all the dynamics. We need to create them. So we need to revisit the existing commitments, and we need to create new ones, obviously, towards the decarbonization. And we should think about a fast-track procedure for adoption and coming into force of these new commitments, because that usually is cumbersome, takes a long time. If we always have to wait for, wait for consensus, and if we always have to wait for national ratification, timing is of the essence also in climate protection. Will it be worth it? The commitments as might be written in Paris, let's be clear about that. I think in my mind that's very clear, will be insufficient for limiting global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees, let alone talking about 1.5 degrees as the small island states do. That's, I think, should be a given. One has to be realistic. So what I'm trying to do here is having a realistic but still ambitious vision of what could be achieved in Paris. Because I think with the elements that I've outlined, we can still have a significant reinforcement of the transformative dynamics towards decarbonization and climate resilience. As I said, not the big solution, but a push towards a dynamic development that perhaps can acquire even more dynamism. It would be then naive to expect a solution from the international level. I already said that. We were naive. Increasingly, I hear people saying that also. But at the same time, it would be cynical and irresponsible not to try to get the most out of Paris and out of the international level, so that we can, as I said, in this vision of a multi-level dynamic process back and forth, can make a step forward, hopefully a significant step forward, that can create and reinforce the dynamism that is emerging anyway. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this realistic optimism that you've offered us. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Already 2 at the front and then a third. So we'll take them once at a time, and please remember to introduce yourselves.
Hi, Michelle Betzel from Colorado State University and visiting at Lund University. Thank you very much for the sort of, for me, a helpful update on where we are in the regime. And I like how both you and Robin sort of were talking about the importance of linking what's happening in the multilateral process to sort of the transnational world or all the other things that are going. And I found in particular your argument that the regime provides signal, direction, infrastructure, and process, sort of a useful way of thinking about that. And, you know, I was particularly struck by some of the graphics you showed on the policy developments and sort of how you can link them to the regime. But I think we need to unpack a little bit more about how that relationship played out. So, and I think in particular, it's very different in the European context versus the U.S., Australia, Canadian context, where in the European context, I think the trading system, the legislation is all expressly linked to the regime and the implementation, whereas in the U.S. context, a lot of it is an effort to sort of replace or react in the absence of sort of a national level commitment to act towards the regime. So I'm wondering if we think about that, do those types of initiatives require different types of signals, institutions, processes from the regime? And how might that change some of the things that you think might need to happen in Paris?
Mm-hmm. A good question. I'm not exactly sure how to think about it, because in my perception, when I look at it, I would expect, and even the state level, etc., in the US, people are coming to the talks at times, and it's an interwoven process where I think even that signal, even if it's not via the federal level in the US, I would expect to still reach it the state level, I hope, that there is this global movement towards decarbonization and that we are moving there. What I can perhaps add is, and that's an element that I didn't really address, there's a lot of thinking at the moment how to bring in the lower levels, be it the states, be it the cities, be it the so-called international cooperative initiatives, how to bring them in, into the international process and link them. And my thinking is not yet complete on that either. That's perhaps why I didn't mention it, because it's difficult to think about it, and it's difficult to judge in the end to what extent we can make sure that any linkage will actually be positive and not hinder further development or just be window dressing, etc. But there are these thoughts on how to do that, whether it's just to give them more visibility at that level, to help them to showcase, or whether there can be some other impulse given to them. So that's an area that I think, well, time is running short for Paris, but that we may want to further think about, and then how that could be done.
Rainer Grundmann, University of Nottingham. Thank you for that inspiring talk, but I'd like to ask two questions. One related to a graph you showed. Maybe you could put it up again about the decarbonization on EU level. That was the one. So you see a dramatic fall in emissions there, but I wonder how much of that is due to factors like exporting manufacturing to overseas countries. If you factor that in, how much of the success would remain? So that's one question. The other one is, you don't talk very much about energy technologies, do you? So you talk about the danger of backsliding at one point. So if countries say, we have economic problems, we can't really stick to our promises, and you somehow want to prevent it. But what if in a scenario where you try to decarbonize and countries experience soaring energy prices, given the technology base they have for energy generation, maybe the lights going out and similar things, what is the solution to that kind of situation?
Mm-hmm. I haven't done the calculations of what the impact of that is, moving production elsewhere and then importing it, etc. But imports have been happening all the time, so I don't know. It's not visible in here, and I don't know what the impact is, and I'm not exactly sure that has had a major impact. So, but I just part on that first question. Energy technologies. Can you remind me of the second one so that I'm.
Yeah, what energy technologies do you think need to be in place to prevent any kind of backsliding from ambitious
for
policy?
backsliding, that's that problem exactly. I'm not sure that it's the backsliding issue is directly connected to the energy technologies. What I would say on the backsliding is we are in a process where countries nationally determine what they put on the table. Obviously, there can always be surprises at some point, that there's a major crisis. But that's just the fact of life. We know that in international law as force majeure. That we will address it. But what I'm not really into is thinking about all eventualities of these things that may be the exception of the rule. And I'm sure we can get a solution for that. I think the bigger problem is to provide the direction and to, when thinking about these cases where 1 in 100 countries has a major problem, where we design solutions for that dilutes the overall signal and direction. So I know that people always, and lawyers tend to do that, but what if this? I think for this agreement, we are not in that ballpark for me in my thinking where what if this and what if that. It's about the big signal and then working out the details later on.
But you are relying heavily on renewables like solar and wind, and we know the limitations with these technologies, and we know the scenarios that have been drawn up if you have a cold winter where the wind doesn't blow. And countries like the UK or Germany, what would they do? So they go to back up power production, which is mainly coal.
Sure.
So we know by the existing technology mix what problems there will be.
Yes, and they need to think them through and need to think about storage, etc. But I was also talking just about renewables. There are others in the industry sector where we'll have other issues that can be addressed through innovation, etc., where we can partially electrify, where we then need more electricity. They can partly then also act as a buffer. But that gets into the details of what countries need to do as homework, of what they can put on the table and what in the future they can commit to. And perhaps as a further element, similar to the kind of subnational developments. Another issue out there is whether we should only talk about targets, timetables, economy-wide emission targets, or whether the agreement should also talk about certain technologies and how to develop them. And perhaps that's what you are hinting at. But I would see those as potentially additional elements that we could bring in. We need, over the longer term, we need a process where countries engage and also exchange information on how all these challenges can be addressed. That's very clear, but that's something that needs to basically come after Paris and needs to be triggered by Paris. So there's still the talk on the table of low emission development plans where countries think that through, what it needs in terms of adaptation of infrastructure, energy systems, etc. And then you need to go sector by sector. But I can't do this here, I think.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I saw Ulrika waving, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for granting me a question on this wonderful presentation. My name is Ulrika Raab. I work for the Swedish Energy Agency, and I should come out front with this. I negotiate for Sweden and the EU in climate change negotiations. So you know where I come from. I liked your presentation. I particularly found one picture very illustrative. It was on the historical developments of pledges. And I think you pinpoint quite a few. This was under section 2, one of the first ones. I think you pinpointed very well the transitions, the change of, you have to go back to the table on section 2, on where we were in Kyoto, where we're heading now, and how it will be different this time around. Here it is, you say soft pledges to perhaps soft pledges again. That is one parameter, soft being, are countries really going to do what they promise? That's a very intriguing question. But the other one is also, what do they promise? We do not want them to promise something that's so easy, it doesn't achieve anything. They will surely fulfill on that, and that won't do anything to solve the climate change problem. The trick is to find something that provides the incentive to be as ambitious as you possibly can, and also give you the flexibility to have the confidence to put that pledge down and not make it too soft. And I think if we look at the UNFCCC, it didn't quantify how much to be achieved. We would just prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. That's kind of diffuse, vague. Kyoto, we had numbers for industrialized countries that achieved about 5% in reductions, possibly. But if you look at the Copenhagen pledges and you add up the numbers, and I can't remember the numbers, perhaps you do. We did have a study on that a few years ago. But if you look at the numbers, potential reductions on mitigations in the Copenhagen pledges, we did move a bit further than Kyoto. And that is not to be forgotten, because it's a step in the right direction and we need to reinforce that. So, do you remember the number? That must be a concrete question. And the other one is that I think I'm very much thinking about the 2020 deal, which is supposed to be agreed in 2015, and how you provide the means of implementation. How do you get countries to do things? What gives them confidence enough to make pledges, and finding tools, flexibilities in achieving those things? And I think that is one of the key features, but there will be more sessions on this, so I will just stop with the question, do you remember how much we have in the pledges?
No, I don't have the numbers at hand. It was just, it's the UNEP gap report, I think, that you may be referring to, where then it was found that there's still a gap between the pledges and what we would need to, in a realistic pathway towards 2 degrees. That gap was quite considerable, and I would always say that they were soft, right? We don't know to what extent they will be achieved, these pledges. Some countries are on track, some others are not necessarily on track, and Japan has weakened its own commitment, or pledge, or whatever you call it. Other than that, I would completely agree that they need the means of implementation. But that's now up, first of all, to the national processes to see what they can do. And ideally, I think also Robin was talking about that, ideally we would need a process of review or something. And you know as well as I do that the EU likes that idea very much, but how realistic is it? But some kind of international process where it's checked and where it's assessed whether that's realistic, whether that's ambitious to some extent, or not just the business as usual, and whether there's actually scope to do more, and perhaps under what conditions. So yes, we need to think about the means of implementations. It's not just putting a number out there and then saying we'll give the signal. So if I was giving that impression in my presentation, to give the realistic and good signal, it needs to be perceived as achievable, as ambitious, etc. And countries need to do their homework, and we need to have international analysis afterwards to make that assessment. So I'm kind of can only just agree with most of what you've said. But I was staying as with respect to the previous question, a little bit at a more general level, because that's, I think, where we will end up in Paris. But we need to establish the infrastructure for the means of implementation, as I said, also with finance, technology, etc., to move forward in the next steps. Thanks.
Thanks. We'll certainly get a good chance to return to these questions after the coffee break. But first we need to give Sebastian a big round of applause.
Thanks.
And then I want to announce, I'm sure that many of you are very eager to have a coffee. Coffee will be served down in the lobby, or the entrance in the restaurant. So you have to walk down the stairs. And I ask you to be back at 11 sharp, because that's when we're going to continue this discussion on a new global climate deal in Paris.